Well, Joseph Coyne, thanks so much for joining me today for an episode of the Track and Field Performance Podcast. How are you keeping?
Good man. Good column. Appreciate it.
Joseph, you are, I suppose a podcast host yourself in the Australian Strength and Conditioning Association. You're a strength and conditioning coach, track and field coach. You're wearing many hats, and I suppose the listeners of this podcast may be familiar with the work that you do or have done in the past, but I'm always keen to get the guests introducing themselves and maybe giving a bit of a background into how you got to where you are today.
Yeah. Long story cut really short. Grew up in New Zealand. Um, Went to school in New Zealand. Went to university in New Zealand. Came to Australia. Um, I'd done like a PE degree in New Zealand, which was a 4-year degree, but you couldn't actually go and teach afterwards. You had to go and do another like year of a grad dip of teaching. So I went and did that. And didn't really know what I wanted to do. Started getting into basic personal training, loved the strength and conditioning side of things, um, and ended up opening up my own shop. Did a little bit of contract work while I was doing it. Did a master's. Like Surfing Australia is just down the road from me, and I ended up doing a master's of research out of Surfing Australia, all on the effects of strength on paddle speed, like surfboard paddling speed. And then few things, always had a foot in the door with athletics and in particular, say, beach sprinters. Beach sprinters in Australia or the area that I'm live in is there's swimming and there's surf lifesaving, and the beach sprinters are part of that surf lifesaving group. And triathlon will be another big one where we live in surfing. But anyway, I'd see a lot of them and ended up getting referred to, called upon by a company called Athletes Performance at the time. They were looking for people to come and help with a athletics job in Taiwan, and then an athletics job with Chinese track and field. Now that didn't actually work out, but in a month or two later, they had a job with the Chinese Olympic Committee servicing just like an institute job, AIS, or I guess it's Irish Institute of Sport or Irish
Hmm.
like sports system, what have you, like government sports system, and ended up getting that job. So went over to China, had that job until their contract finished, and then transitioned. By that time, I got to know the track and field folks and the coaches and the athletes because I helped them out, um, and transitioned to being a coach with Chinese track and field. That ran through Olympics in 2016, World Champs 2017. Then came home, thought I was done with China. Um, the UFC came knocking and said, "Hey, we're setting up a new performance institute in Shanghai. Would you be interested? Love for you to lead the program there." And I was like, "Hey, let's chat." And one thing led to another. I ended up going back over to China for another 2 years, but massively COVID interrupted. Was apart from the family for a while, and that was one of the major factors in not staying with the UFC, I guess, or being able to stay with the UFC. And then came back to Canada actually, because my family was in Canada during COVID, and then we all came back to Australia. And now I work at Bond University with their elite sports program, and in particular the swimming program at Bond. Um, and also I work at a high school called Lindisfarne Anglican Grammar. It's an independent school, so a private school. And I'm the director of high performance and sports development at the school. And basically, I look after their rugby program, their athletics program, and they have a sports academy for kids in any sport that are state level, like make a state team or place in a true state competitions, true state championship, like one, two, or three. And we'll look after them with, say, strength conditioning, sports psychology, sports dietetics, and we have providers that come in and service them. So yeah, that's a bit about what I've done and what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, sounds very exciting. Like a lot of things there that we could potentially pick up on because they are all so different. But I suppose it would be silly not to talk a little bit about your time in China because I know that you worked closely there with one of the very best track and field coaches that we talk about today in Randy Huntington. Um, and just kind of, if you would give us a little bit of an overview of what your kind of role was like there, alongside him, and some of the key learnings from really your time there.
Yeah, sure. So, man, I actually lived with Randy for about a year and a half. Um, Myself, Randy, and another coach called Damien Arsenio, who's a French pole vault coach. We all roomed together for about that year and a half. My role with Randy basically was like an assistant coach. I was I worked across the jump and sprint section. At the time, Randy was just coaching the long jumpers, but I'd have to help I basically be an assistant coach for him and also take care of all the strength and power work, like non-technical strength and power work, is what I'll term it. But then also have to work with, say, the women's 4x100, work with some high jumpers, work with some individual male sprinters based on need and what the requests were. So that was what I was doing with him, yeah, in that time. Prior to that, actually, I'll say prior to that too, with the Olympic Committee job, got to know Randy, helped him out with profiling of his athletes, in terms of strength diagnostics, strength and power diagnostics, and some training ideas. But in that role, it was interesting. Like I love athletics, right? But in the scheme of things for the Chinese Olympic Committee, athletics doesn't bring back many gold medals. So oftentimes I'd have their like athletics scheduled, a Randy's group scheduled, and then it would get bumped for weightlifting or ping pong or something like that. Just the nature of the beast over there.
Hmm. And like going away from that, let's say, time with the Chinese committee and also just working with Randy, like, do you think that you changed a lot of your ideas around strength and conditioning, or more specifically, maybe where strength and conditioning sits within the whole like kind of performance equation, particularly when it comes to track and field athletes? Like, did you have kind of ideas before that kind of got shifted, and maybe it relates to exercise, but also maybe it relates to how it fits in the whole scheme, if that makes sense?
Yeah, look, for sure. No, I'd probably credit Randy for the most development I've done as a coach would have been in that 18-month period, in terms of thinking of things a little bit differently. So some of the things were just reinforced, uh, but definitely if you're working in as a say strength conditioning coach, you probably have most influence in sports that are the centimeter, kg, or second sports. You know what I mean? Ones that you can time with a stopwatch, ones that you can measure with a tape measure. Um, those are sports that you'll probably have the most influence on. And the influence, it might just be a different influence in other sports. So in team sports, it might be more of a cultural influence. And I was definitely a cultural influence with Randy's group at the time as well. But it might be a cultural influence. It might be you know what I mean? It's just slightly different. But the actual outcomes on performance, you'll probably have the most influence on outcomes of performance outcomes in those sports as a strength conditioning coach. Um, but yeah, and like even just not just Randy, but being around, like China had a really good group of coaches at the time. A lot of international coaches, like just watching them day in, day out, also going to, say, your diamond leagues, going to your world champs, going to um, Olympics, seeing how other international coaches are doing things with their athletes. It's just, you're like a sponge and you pick up things, oh, that's kind of cool. I might keep that in the back pocket for when I want to apply that. So definitely, Randy was a huge influence, but also seeing people like Damien work. There's a high jump coach that I work co closely with, who was Jungle Way's coach. He was a 238 high jumper at the time. Um, and also seeing some of the European throws coaches that were contracted to China, seeing their work was really interesting as well.
Hmm. There was quite a group when you were there. If I do remember correctly, there was a slew of like 8 meter jumpers that eventually most of them got up towards the 830 region and beyond. I'm interested to know about like each of those individual athletes and maybe how they were treated individually, I suppose, within the training setup from a like programming or, physiological standpoint, if that makes sense, and maybe some of the considerations that you had to make when working with those athletes.
Mm. So yeah, it was a pretty good group. I think in 2017 we had five of the world's top 20, and there was also a guy part of that had had a year off and coming back, but he was a Chinese national record holder that's since been equaled by one of the jumpers there, but he was an 848 jumper.
Oh yeah.
Sonny was his name. And so really,
Li
really good group.
Jinzai, is it? Li Jinzai?
Yeah, Lee Jin.
Yeah. I knew I was going to butcher the
Yeah, yeah.
pronunciation, but yeah,
No, no,
roughly.
no, that's all right. Yeah, Legion Jur. So that that group was pretty high level when it comes to international jumps. And I don't know many others that would have sort of five or six of that sort of top 20 in the world and being able to work with them day in, day out. In terms of the training, like practically a lot of the training would get designed around um, who the primary athletes were, and this is just the nature of the beast. But then
Mm,
from there, there'll be individual adaptations for different athletes. So one might do a little bit more volume, one might do a little bit less, and it might even be as simple. Oh, one is a hamstring, um, like a nuisance in the hamstring, and we need to tone back on his max speed work. You know what I mean? It might be injury based. Um, it might be volume based, where okay, for instance, one of them, Gauching Long, um, was an athlete we felt that he couldn't handle heavy, like high volume or heavy intensity in back-to-back days. So he might have more rest. He might be like a high, low, high, low, high, low type person. And it wouldn't exactly roll into that, but it would get melded into the overall team microcycle. As to say, Eddie Wang Jianan, who's now the co-holder of that national record holder, the 848, he might be able to handle 3 days of high intensity, high volume if you really get after him. Um, and then so the scheme was set up predominantly around your sort of key athletes in mind, and then the other ones would fit into them, and then we'd adapt things within the session, like micro adaptations, I'd call them, where say Gauching Line might be concentrated on contact time. Shu Hao might be horizontal velocity. So there's little tweaks to how you work, and as a coach, it's like logistics, and the outcomes you want, and how do you start getting after them.
mm. So yeah, so it's very much almost identifying, a variety of things, whether it's strengths and weaknesses physiologically, but then also perhaps how can they be developed in a sensible way that's no, not even sensible, sustainable probably is more of a better way to kind of phrase it, wouldn't it be?
For sure. Yeah, you want something that will give them. I always think of it like flying, and you want to get enough altitude, but you don't want to get too close to the sun that you get burnt. So you've got to find that sweet spot. And sometimes you let them down a little bit lower, sometimes you take them up a bit higher, but you never want to get too burnt. You want to get enough to get a tan, you know what I mean, from the sun. Um, but you don't want to never have a tan, but you don't want to get burnt. So it's that balancing act. And look, we did that through like mainly Randy's, I guess, feel and my feedback, some gym-based measures a little bit, and but along with the subjective feedback was we used a device called Amiga Wave, which is a heart rate variability and DC direct current potential device, measuring device. Probably used it for about a year without even trying to make any modifications, and just seeing what the responses were and how that played out. And then from there, I guess, a bit more confident in applying different tweaks to the system.
Mm. So it was kind of gathering the initial data in that year, but then kind of been able to use that once accumulated in a kind of intuitive way.
Yeah, yeah. But one, to see if it actually lined up with what we're seeing, and
Hmm.
it wasn't something that would shoot us information that we're like, we can't trust this. Um, and then two, yeah, actually building up that experience with it to be able to go, okay, if we make this decision, it's probably based on good judgment right now from the information we've gathered. Um, and yeah, look, I ended up using Amiga Wave for my PhD. We used it if one with the like one research part of that was on the jumpers and sprinters into Rio, and another one was part on some UFC athletes. Um, but that type of feedback, whether it's heart rate variability, direct current, might need a bit more work, but it's a pretty interesting addition to subjective feelings of the athlete, subjective feelings of the coach, and how you might modify training based on what you're seeing.
In addition to that, I suppose we're talking about subjectivity, was it difficult to, get that feedback within the setup, given that they were, speaking a different language, or I'm assuming you may have had a translator for that, to kind of relay it to you guys?
Yeah, yeah. So here's the thing. My Chinese actually got really good. My Mandarin got really good
Okay.
during that time because there was a translator assigned for Randy, but when I had to work with other athletes like the sprinters or the high jumpers, and she had to do work with Randy at the same time. I just had to try and speak Mandarin to them. So I'd be up studying the night before, learning what I needed to be saying or thinking what I needed to be saying. And yeah, my Mandarin got really good at the time. But you're right, there's definitely, I'd say there's a lot of body language you pick up on. And even I credit an Australian swim coach, Matt Brown, for this one. It's the talk test basically. Athletes walk in, they're shooting the breeze, they're chirpy, heads are up, body language is good, posture's good. Man, that he would say you haven't been training them hard enough. Then they come in, they're like zombies, they're fighting amongst one another, their heads are down, slouched, they're irritable. Maybe you're training them a little bit too much. Somewhere in between is probably that sweet spot. So that type of stuff, that body language stuff, that's universal across all races, all cultures. Um, but yeah, the language in terms of coaching people, motivating people, that's a totally different thing.
Mm. Yeah, that's a useful way to kind of assess alongside your analogy that you gave, or your description of not getting too close to the sun a few minutes ago, just kind of being able to assess that body language. And yeah, there's a whole slew, obviously, as you get into a cultural kind of environment where you really have to kind of know the intricate details of how they communicate amongst each other, and that becomes probably a very, very long process to really understand how to communicate with people really effectively. And thankfully, I suppose you did have Omega Wave there to put I suppose objective feedback to subjective reads from them. I'm interested to know, alongside like the, I suppose, training philosophy, did you come in with different thoughts around strength and conditioning that were influenced with Randy's presence? Because I know he has quite a, at this point, well documented philosophy on strength and conditioning. And I'm wondering, were you already there at that point, kind of yourself within your own practice, or did it pivot a little bit when you got there?
Um, I would say I was like sort of 80% already there. Like my experience in, say, track, generally, if you boil strength conditioning coaches down, it's like, hey, uh, and maybe this is being flippant, but it's like, man, squat, bench press, deadlift, maybe do some Olympic lifts. You know what I mean? Try and go as heavy as possible as a like general thing. But you quickly realize when you're dealing with people, man, there's a point of diminishing returns. Work great for developing athletes, kids that are young, just driving those numbers up, and can still work great for advanced athletes if they're a person that responds to that strength training, and that strength training stimulus. But you'll learn pretty quickly that there's people that once they get to a certain point, they're just getting beat up or they're feeling fatigued, or you know what I mean? They're not progressing in their sport. So yeah, look, I was 80% there. I'd say that the thing that I really liked about Randy was um, the use of wearable resistance, even like ankle weights, wrist weights, um, and even a couple of other coaches too, weight vests and how we'd apply that. And that gave me a lot of different ideas on, okay, when do we fit this in? You can call it special strength training, special development exercises, or you can just call it loaded skill exercises as well. Would be the best thing. And I even don't think that it's almost a strength conditioning intervention. I think it's like a technical intervention. It's something that you give somebody a little bit more load to make them feel the skill in a slightly different way so they become better when you take that load off. And it's just driving different kinesthetic awareness, driving different coordination, improving coordination patterns. So yeah, I almost like to think of it as loaded skill or loaded technical training. And look, you can do that at any time, but depends what you're doing it for. If you want to do it before, like it's part of a sort of strength conditioning intervention, it might be in the last little bit before a major meet, um, or it might be before you start your taper. Um, Alternatively, if you just want it in as a skill acquisition tool all the way through, you can keep it all the way through. Just depends on what your approach is at the time.
Mm. Yeah, I'm interested to pick on that a little bit, just where, you guys would make those decisions around, particularly like let's take ankle weights and wrist weights, where would you start to kind of say that needs a little bit of an intervention? Like, is it the lack of dorsiflexion or something of that nature through performing a takeoff drill or a particular sprinting drill where you're saying if we load that, we can bring awareness to the area? I'd be interested to know how you would kind of make those assessments.
Yeah, so there's a bit of that. Like for instance, Gao Long he was too short on his like ultimate or takeoff contact time. Not by much, but pretty hard to change a guy from taking off at like 100 to 110 milliseconds to 110 or 115 to 130,
Mm,
right? It's like very hard. And so we'd do takeoff drills with extra load, additional load with him to get him to feel the ground a bit more as a intervention. But that was one particular intervention. Alternatively, we just used it across the group as a general setting, okay, we're going to use this just to get more skill acquisition from you. And this is what we're doing for the next 4 weeks. I mean, just like a training block of strength or power, this is our approach um, to that power, that real high velocity power, but also skill acquisition at the same time. Or at least I definitely saw the skill acquisition part of it.
mm. Yeah, well, I mean, if it was broken down simply, in my mind, when I think of that, I'm thinking of like a sled would encourage horizontal projection. And that is it's a physiological thing, like, but it's also a skill thing, isn't it, as well? In that, like, you kind of, by dragging the sled, are able to be more forward, be lower to the ground, whatever it may be.
For sure, for sure. And then I actually term it, everyone's heard of like progressive loading, right? I actually call it progressive unloading. Where man, you might use heavier ankle weights, heavier wrist weights, heavier weight vests, heavier sleds. You know what I mean? As you get the feel for what things should look like, then that starts getting lighter and lighter and lighter. So you get closer and closer to body weight, which is how you got to apply the skill in real life. The same thing, you can do the same thing with any of your ballistic lifts. You might get and I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but say you're doing a counter movement jump, a loaded counter movement jump, and set your optimal power weight, and maybe I don't know, maybe at 3,000 watts, maybe it's at 80 kgs. Then you go, which is neither here nor there, but maybe it's just at 80 kgs, 3,000 watts. Then you can go, all right, we're going to take 10 kgs off the bar. We want you to move the bar quicker and try and still hit 3,000 watts. When you can do that, we're going to take another 10 kgs off the bar. It's going to be 60 kgs, and we want you to still hit 3,000 watts. You know what I
Mm.
mean? So it's progressive unloading, and it just changes the power equation in terms of the mass is lighter, so you've got to move it quicker to hit the same power numbers. Um, so that would be what I'd term now a progressive unloading approach, and can be really valuable for the right athletes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was listening to some good conversations the other day by another Australian coach that you may be familiar with, Christopher Dale. He was talking a little bit about how VBT and things like that are applied and how we can kind of get a little bit caught up in peak power numbers and not actually looking at some of the other metrics that kind of influence that and the other constraints that influence that as well, such as range of motion, etc. You had mentioned that you liked that Randy was kind of going in the direction of wearable devices and things like that. And I'm interested to know, did you start to look at the likes of eccentric RFD and time to peak velocity a little bit more when you got into his setup, or was that again something that you were already realizing that, was a missing part of the equation if we're really going to get transfer out of weight training for especially those people who are at that level of diminishing returns a bit more?
Yeah, so Matt, I had experience with gym aware, velocity-based training, at least monitoring of speeds and things like that, prior to. And we didn't have a complex system with the velocity work we did. Um, Basically would ask for a certain threshold and you keep putting the weight up if you can maintain that threshold. It was one approach basically. So it would be 2.2 peak velocity, 2.2 meters per second. And man, you keep going as heavy as you can. When that starts to slow down, then we don't go any heavier. That was one approach we used. because it had to be simple in that environment with language, things like that. Did do did also work in a roundabout way, like all the Kaiser machines have built-in um, wattage meters or power meters, and we used a lot of Kaiser. So that essentially is measuring the velocity as well, and would work a lot to those power numbers and improving power numbers in some key lifts. And it might have been things like your squat pattern. It might have been things like even seated calf was one would monitor and get after. But the in terms of like how I think about it now, I actually there's still like a place for slow repetitions for adaptations to muscular tenderness, like units, all those types of things. And it depends on the athlete, depends on their um, biomechanics, on their injury history, all these types of things that you've got to take into account. I'd probably move more to mean velocity rather than just having a heavy focus with a ballistic work on the peak velocity as well. Um, Now that I know a little bit more, but yeah, I'd already had quite a bit of familiarity with it. In my master's research actually on surfing, we essentially used like a really big gym wear that was flipped on its side. You'd put it on the back of the athlete, and they'd pull it. It was like a 1080 essentially, but non-motorized, and they'd sprint paddle from one end of the pool to the other and would measure the peak velocity, mean velocity, things like that. So um, already had, and essentially it's just like a fishing line that measures how fast it's going out and how far it goes. Um, but yeah, already had a bit of experience then, and I think the application of it, you got to one of the big things for coaches, and this is what I see that mate, I see a lot of this happening, but one thing I really try and do, I just teach the athletes how to do it. So I don't have to do it. So I can actually coach when I'm there. I don't want to be mucking around with an iPad or trying to fix a gym wear unit, try and get it connected. I'm like, I teach them all how to do it in session one. Then I'll help them from there. But it's like, okay, boys, girls, get the gym wears out, you set it up, you turn it on. These are the speeds you're after. Make sure you're on top of it. If you have any questions, come let me know. Because you don't want to be like staring at an iPad trying to figure something out when in the background some lad is doing something really silly or something they shouldn't be doing. When you're trying to figure out how to work a gym wear or any technology. So that'll be one tip I'd definitely say for any technology you use. Teach the athletes how to do it so you can coach. You don't have to do it for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially in your setting right now, that's quite a lot of athlete management to be really anywhere else and doing anything else. So that makes complete sense. Um, yeah, I'm interested to know, and might be a really stupid question, but where did the kind of 2.2 threshold come out of for the Olympics? Like, was there a specific kind of rationale for that, or?
Yeah, the rationale was we started at 2 meters per second, and when we were watching it, we're like, oh, it doesn't look quite fast enough. Let's go 10% faster. So, but there was no like scientific, it was almost purely subjective, like that. Oh, when we're watching this, I would actually like it to be a bit faster. Let's set it at 2.2.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that no, I mean, makes sense. Like, I mean, it is ultimately supposed to have transference to the events, which are really rapid triple extension. So yeah, no, I guess that makes sense. And I've definitely gone down the rabbit hole myself as an athlete and seeing, I'm sure others have as well, where just keep placing more load on it. You get heavier, you get the bar up, but ultimately it is getting further away from what your event pretty much requires you to do. And I've actually got to the point now where like my own personal best, I think on a power clean is 135, but I've never saw any gains beyond in terms of sprinting or jumping performance beyond like 127. Like it never got better, and probably hurt my recovery if anything. So, I've realized at this point that it probably, um, if I'm hanging around the 120, 125 mark and it's moving well, then we're probably good enough, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's cost benefit to everything, cost benefit to everything, and you got to think what's the sport? The sport's moving very fast or jumping very far at body weight. There'll be benefits to putting additional load on uh, to drive that, but at some point there's diminishing returns. So I always think that way, almost like a economist, and okay, where are we going to get our next performance gain from? Is it horizontal velocity? Is it takeoff? Is it landing, for instance, for a long jumper? Like, is it approach accuracy? Where's that next performance gain coming from? And that's what you narrow in on for that person. Like you do a needs analysis. How do I compare uh, against where I want to be? If there's a good example, show you how top six 2017, slowest horizontal velocity of the final. Okay, it's pretty clear. We probably want to improve its horizontal velocity for him to jump further. So there's things like that you've got to always be working back from the sport, always be working back from that performance and going, okay, how am I going to get that little bit extra? And man, sometimes it might involve heavy cleans, but the heavy cleans are, well, heavy snatches, whatever, they're over here. They're another sport. Um, so yeah, I always like to just put first principles, work back from the sport and go from there. And it'll save you a lot of time and anguish and heartbreak.
Mm. Yeah, have you kind of found like, because you've been in the strength and conditioning community for quite a while, like have you found that like there has been maybe a little bit of a, I suppose, people have got more stuck to exercises or things in isolation versus the kind of first principles and lost sight of them? And do you find that to be quite like normal?
Yeah, I mean it's a easy trap. I'm guilty of it as well. Like,
Hmm.
oh man, this VBT stuff. Oh, we can do some things here. Um, or this maybe it's a percentage system. I don't know. We can do some cool stuff here. This periodization scheme for the weights. We can do some cool things here. But yeah, if it's not directly linked to a performance outcome in the sport, you got to question, hey man, why am I doing this? Why are we doing this? Why are we wasting energy where the athlete could be either resting and adapting to training or doing more of the stuff they need, which is the technical training. So it's that cost benefit and you got to figure that out.
Mm. And just on that note, while you were kind of in, China and things like that, or even just now, like how you think about things, do you kind of, I suppose, set the sessions up in a way to complement a lot of the learning that you want to take place in the sport specific context? And this could be like just the same for like, your work with swimming. Like how are you, I suppose, thinking about where that work fits in the entire scheme and how do you order it?
So normally all the sessions will start with some type of foot-eye coordination. And if it's a sprinter or a jumper, maybe hand-eye coordination as well, juggling, I mean, hacky, soccer, it's just as the better you can make another basic principle I work off, you want to make your arms like your legs. They should be able to bear weight and handle weight, and you should be able to walk on them. And you should try and make your feet like your hands. You want to have dexterity to your feet and your movements and your lower limb. So those are some guiding principles I always work with, just for basic humans. Doesn't matter what sport you are.
Mm,
Um, and then the other basic principles now: speed before power, power before strength. Okay, if you're setting up a session, it's got all those components in it. It might be like that throughout the week as well. And you might contrast things in a session. Um, one thing I would recommend, and we did a lot of contrast work with Randy, but one thing I would recommend is some athletes respond better to contrast work than others. Some people respond better to compound work, where you just do all the speed work, then all the power work, then all the strength work. You actually have to measure that with the athletes to actually know how they're going to respond. Some, like I said, there'll be a potentiation effect. Some, there'll be a decrement effect, depending on what loads you're lifting, rest periods between. Even if it's optimized for them, there might still be a decrement effect. So just because we've got, say, French contrast or contrast training, there'll be differences in every, especially if you're working with the elite, you want to find out, man, and what I'm doing is that actually enhancing performance. Okay, so if you do contrast and the jumps keep going up and up and up, like, yeah, okay, we're onto something here. If you do contrast and jumps stay the same or start going down, you're like, oh, man, maybe I want to look at compounding this. Okay, just as a session maker. But yeah, general rules of thumb, yeah, speed before power, power before strength for a jumper and a sprinter.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so then comes in the equation like just on that topic is like endurance. Would you change it at all, or would it be much the same? Like,
So endurance in the, say, weight room where maybe you're going after, say, higher reps, probably don't have much space for that with um, sprinters and jumpers, just for fiber typology and fiber type adaptation. You might do things like clusters, like 5 reps, rest 30 seconds, 5 reps, rest 30 seconds, 5 reps. If you want to get like an adaptation, like a hypertrophic adaptation at a joint or tendon, what have you, that's definitely an option. Um, the endurance outside of that would be your stock standard tempo work, which will be done maybe 2 days a week. Does this like an active recovery type thing, and in the like in a gait fashion. Might be done on bikes if there's lower limb issues. You know what I mean? Like say jumper's got a jammed takeoff leg ankle. He's probably better off doing his tempo work in the pool on the bike.
Mm.
All right. So there's those facets to it. But yeah, the endurance work, you might also use some like speed endurance. What track coaches will use speed endurance, like 120s to 150s to 180s. But they would be peppered in at a certain part of the season. Um, we actually did a bit of that in a training camp before the 2016 like Rio Olympics for the jumpers. They were running 120s, 150s for a certain period, a couple of weeks. But yeah, there's got to be rhyme or reason to why you put that stuff in.
Mm.
And I
Yeah.
always think I'll go back to that fiber type adaptations. I'm always thinking of the strength training and the stuff you do in the gym is probably, and the sprinting actually, um, is probably one of the biggest drivers for those fiber type adaptations. And your job is to maximize the adaptations you want. If you're working at the spectrum of sprint and jump, um, this will be this will be your type two. If you're working at the spectrum of like marathon, long distance swimming, your spectrum will be the type one.
Mm. Yeah, that's very interesting. And particularly one part there that I didn't expect you to say at all was just the need for general like proprioception is what I gathered, just being able to use your hands like your feet and your feet like your hands. Um, where did that first principle arise? Where did you kind of feel like that was a necessary component of how you coach people?
Man, probably personal experience. Like I did adult gymnastics. Um, Coaches used to, this is when I was in my mid 20s, coaches used to make us like go round the full gym, which is probably like close to 250 meters and different variations of animal crawls and things like that. And you see gymnasts and yeah, that they can use their hands like their feet. You know what I mean? They can bear load in the upper body. Um, the Chinese gymnastics would sometimes come to the indoor track, and the coaches would make the normally the girls run laps, and then they might run some laps, and then they'll spend up to 15 minutes in a handstand just against the wall, sometimes walking around, coming back to the wall. Phenomenal stuff when you think about it. Most people struggle to hold a handstand for a minute, let alone be able to stay up with support, you know what I mean, for like 10 to 15 minutes. But that definitely had an influence on me, just seeing those sports work and how they work. But yeah, big on that foot-eye coordination. If it's hard for like if we think about a technical skill, regardless of what it is, hitting a golf ball, running fast, jumping far, shooting a basketball, they're all just electrical currents from the brain to the extremities to coordinate in a certain way. If you want to run faster, the the probably biggest improvement that you'll make is from your intermuscular coordination. So how well you can coordinate your limbs at speed, at those higher and higher speeds. So it makes sense to me. The more skills you have in your pocket, the better you'll be able to build on those skills to drive better coordination. So that foot-eye coordination, if you can't coordinate your foot with like juggling a soccer ball or things like that, you might struggle to coordinate your foot in a drill or get the skill acquisition that when a coach gives you a drill, like I don't know, and a bound or what have you, and be able to control the lower limb where the shank is relative to the thigh at higher speeds. I'd probably say if you struggle with something like other foot eye tasks, like coordination tasks, you're probably going to struggle with that as well. Maybe,
Mm.
maybe not, but as a general rule of thumb, I'd say that'd be pretty common.
Yes, it seems like it falls in line almost with the idea that, we should teach our kids to play many different sports because they will have a larger toolbox of how to solve problems when they go into a more specific one later down the line.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I'd say it's balanced with the type of sport it is. So, for instance, gymnastics, if you want to be going to the Olympics when you're, say, 15, there's only so much window that you have to train for that in your early years. Um, if it's a different, and it depends on the culture as well. But yeah, in general, my opinion is kids should be exposed, and even professional athletes, Olympic athletes, international athletes should be exposed to different sports. Even as they get older and older, there'll be things they'll pick up. Like I think of Tom Walsh, the thrower, doing slacklining. Um, you know what I mean? I think of some of the gymnastic stuff I see from the javelin guys like Thomas Roller. Um, all all that will have benefit.
Yeah, definitely. I even seen like an athlete who is interestingly, he's 31 now and he had the best year of his life in long jumping and he done multi events for the first time ever because he was coaching and he was kind of learning stuff anyway and he ended up doing multi events in the indoors and he swears that pretty much just kind of having such a varied winter training for the first time in his kind of professional career was very much why he was able to kick on so much that year more than any. And
Mm,
and they're very interesting because you'd almost think at that age that you're getting away from specificity, but perhaps sometimes just variance is a good thing for the body to relearn. I don't know the science of that, but
mm. If you look at it as like through a skill acquisition lens rather than a physical output lens, uh, I think there's great value to it. And like Eddie Wang Jianan, he was easily the kid that had played the most sports when he was growing up, and easily the best athlete across all the sports, and was our best jumper as well. Um, so yeah, I mean that's just a case study of like 5 to 6 athletes, but you see it in a lot of things. I can point out the best performing swimmer in the like picked up a silver medal, bronze medal at the Olympics, just gone. Easily the best skill acquisition in different tasks. Didn't play a lot of different sports, but definitely has a talent for skill acquisition in different tasks when we throw things at him, more so than some of the other group that he trains with, who are also very high level swimmers as well. Um, but yeah,
yeah.
I think it's a thing you always want to keep in the back of your mind.
Yeah, and as you say, almost there, although you didn't say it directly, is just kind of like not always important to look at just the physiological side of things. There is another element to it as well, skill acquisition. Another thing that I think does help skill acquisition in general, and you mentioned it already, maybe not in this context, but is performing that kind of a needs analysis. Um, for me personally, like I've done that just being a self-coach athlete like the last year or so. Um, it brought about a lot of self-awareness towards what needed to be done, and then kind of was able to isolate skills um, for me in sessions. As I was kind of doing them, I had to uphold a lot of what I writ down and keep myself accountable. So I'm interested to know, like, what your kind of process is when you get new athletes. Like, do you perform a needs analysis, on a yearly basis, or is it a cycle by cycle basis? Like, how do you kind of tend to map that out?
Yeah, so look, the best needs analysis is like biomechanical reports from your actual event, and seeing where you compare to world's best, for instance. Um, if someone's jumping, I don't know, 840, you're jumping 830, what's the differences? Where are those differences? Can we improve those differences? Sometimes if it's height, you might not be able to improve those differences. But then the sort of next tier down is, and jumps coach been using these for forever. Short approach jumps like 6 step, 9 step, 12 step, 15. You know what I mean? How does that compare to actually the full approach? Approach speed. What's the like long jump distance, for instance? Very highly correlated, like 92% correlation with, and correct me if I'm wrong there, and it'll be there or thereabouts in between that 90 to 95% bandwidth correlation with approach speed in the last sort of 5 meters, 2 meters, your distance. So, man, what's the actual speed in the last 5 meters of their approach when they're running their approach? Then you've got all your other things like your standing long, standing triple, standing five jump. What's the distance like when they do those? Where does that compare to other athletes like that? Like I help out a group in the US, a collegiate group that has pros associated with it. There's one girl there at the Olympics last year had like a 320 standing long for a short girl is phenomenal. You know what I mean? But those are the kind of benchmarks, bandwidths you can compare against and go, oh well. The approach side of things, the horizontal velocity is actually pretty good. It's the jump side of things that we need to focus on or tease out. Or maybe, man, our short approach jumps are really close to our full approach jump. We should be going further off the full approach. There's something happening with the approach and something's going on there. So that's like the needs analysis testing battery. And then I guess third tier, you break it down and you go, okay, how do we find out more about this performance problem? Do we need to do things like if contact time's an issue, do we need to look at, say, unilateral pogo jumps, for instance, and see what their like RSI is like? Do we need to look at a seated calf? Like maybe it's an isometric on a some force plates. Maybe it's like a Kaiser seated calf. Maybe it's just a how much weight can they do on the seated calf relative to body weight. Um, and so you use those additional tests to help you confirm or exclude what's going on with the athlete. And it might be, man, you've got quadrants. They can be perfect. Quadrant up here might be, hey, we can say this is probably just a technical issue. The physical components look pretty good. Then, and the other quadrant down here, well, the technical stuff looks pretty good, but the physical is below where it should be. And then the last one, we need to do work on both technical and physical, technical and non-technical. So it's just a fact-finding mission. You go from your like ultimate tier, which is the actual event, down to the test that would be like first tier, down to the second tier, and you work your way through based on what appears to be the issue. And it's like an a la carte approach to performance profiling. If you ask me, man, common, I'd call them second tier assessments we'd use. Definitely counter movement jump, definitely pogo, single leg, double leg, one leg box jump of 40 centimeters found really related to their jumping ability, like actual off the board. Maybe it's your eccentric stress, all that type of thing. But yeah, those would be ones that I'd hang my head on. And then you go into things like power on a Kaiser squat or what's their clean like, all those types of things. But those are all like maybe fourth or fifth tier with what you're looking at.
And will that like kind of assessment then inform, and I mean it's probably obvious, right? But let's just say, it will inform, the training components and what needs to be included more. But let's say it was something like an RSI, deficit of sorts. Like, are you going to then spend longer in that zone? Is it really going to govern? Because we have these ideal progressions in our mind, right? It's like we're going to move from max strength to RFD to like more, you know, eccentric RFD, if that was your progression in your mind as a strengths coach. But you carry out this needs analysis and then you're like, okay, well, actually, maybe we need to spend longer in this zone and maybe we don't move to that yet. Is that kind of where you're kind of going with a lot of those things?
Yeah, 100%. Like, if you're dealing like with the elite, I guess I'd say those progressions of, hey, we go with strength, then we go to some power, then we go to some speed or whatever, like general prep, specific prep, special development. Um, they want to be melded more into a needs analysis. So in general prep, for instance, you might be doing RSI style work right from where to go, but you might just be doing a little bit less of it than what you would normally do. Sorry, a little bit more of it than what you'd be normally doing in your general prep phase. And then you might be doing a little bit more of it by the time you get to your special development phase. So it's the merging of those two. I think that's where the real magic happens. And then another sort of saying I had my hat on is Give the athlete what they need when they need it. They need something now. Don't wait for tomorrow. Like start giving it to them to see if it helps them. Because you might go, if you stick to sort of, I don't know, there's a 12, 16 week preparation for before you start actually jumping in competition season, and you only bring something in right in for the last 4 weeks, man, you could have wasted 8 weeks of 12 weeks of doing this work with somebody and getting adaptations that are going to help them jump better or sprint faster. So yeah, it's I think that merging of the needs analysis and our ideas around periodization, whatever they may be for a particular coach, that's where the magic happens.
Mm, mm. And do you find then as a result then progressions can be a bit deceiving, like for a lot of us in terms of we get kind of too caught up in them and they guide our decision making versus what, as you said, is kind of giving the athlete what they need when they need it. Because like there's a lot of stuff out there with strength training is one, but plyometrics too, like, you know, and you work with youth development athletes of all kinds, like I can imagine that, you know, that becomes even trickier when you're getting in that environment.
Mm, mm. Yeah, so with the like senior athletes, I'm almost a good big fan of just you can just pick um like 3 lifts maybe and you go, okay, we're going to do this all season long. These are going to be your lifts. We'll modify them, but it might be some type of low. What's your favorite lower body? Is it leg press, back squat, front squat, trap bar deadlift? What's your favorite one? Okay, we're going to use varieties of that throughout the season, but you're going to do it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So you're so good at it when by the time we actually get to the end of the season, it's such a familiar stress that we can load it the way we want to. We can do eccentric attenuated work. We can do like power work, speed work with it. It's not going to go from going like, oh, we're going to do leg press here, then back squat here, then trap bar deadlift here. It's the stress is the same all the way through. So I'm a big fan of that approach, and that's thinking from like Anatoly Bondarchuk basically. His approach with athletes, man, you just keep consistent stimulus. Eventually they'll adapt to it. When they stop adapting, change the stimulus. So I might say the group I'm working with, and it wouldn't be junior athletes by any means, but it'd be more like your senior athletes. Okay, this season, man, cleans are going to be our lift. We're going to do these pretty much once a week, guaranteed, maybe twice a week. But they'll be done at different speeds, different loads, things like that. And you're just going to get super good at doing cleans. And then maybe if you get good enough next season, we'll do snatches. And then when you get good enough at that, season after that, man, I might let you choose cleans or snatches, depending on what you like best. So I work in that consistent applied stress across, and I think across multi-year, and you just make those stresses familiar as possible.
Would you have somewhat of a similar opinion on plyometrics, or does it kind of stretch a little bit more than that for, you know, again, a variety of reasons? Because they do have, I suppose, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, but they have an ability to tap into many more qualities because they can be kind of more on the very on the power side, but also quite on the, I suppose, reactive side too.
So plyometrics, like in typical, you have to know what they're actually already getting from technical training. Typical technical training for track and field, there's a lot of plyometric activity going on
Mm.
with what you're doing. So then you have to think, okay, how am I going to make that different to actually drive an adaptation? Because I keep doing the same of it, or just add more volume. Maybe it gives us something. Maybe the extra volume gives us something. But for me, I'm like, okay, how do we modify this? Okay, maybe it's jumps with a little bit of load. Maybe it's jumps with a little bit more load. It might not be technically plyometric below 250 milliseconds, but there's some type of um, intervention there that's changing the stimulus from what they're getting just from their technical training. So that's a big thing with jump training, plyometrics for me. If you're not working with track and field athletes, where the volume of like sprinting and jumping isn't anywhere near as high, then you still want to have that consideration, but it's probably a little bit less of a consideration, if that makes sense, because they're not doing as much plyometric activity or not doing as much jumping activity. Um, and then it just comes down to what type of jumps do you want to prioritize? Where's the performance gap? Is it a short contact time gap? Is it a longer contact time gap? Um, and how does that look like for where you're going to find your route that you want to apply with the athlete?
And can it be sometimes a bit of both? I guess in a kind of perfect world, you might want to up the power, but you might also want to up the reactivity, um, somewhat simultaneously. Or is that kind of not really something that you can do in the sense that like they kind of are going to inhibit each other in some way from an adaptation standpoint, and rather it's like we can start by addressing the power early in the year and then kind of go towards a reactivity thing. But I guess what I'm saying is like if you wanted to enhance both because you believe both could be better, um, you would kind of try to do it in a gradual, kind of sequential manner versus rather trying to do them simultaneously.
So yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends on the athlete, um, developing athlete, not in terms of age, but in terms of like exposure to training. Sequential might be better, but I'd probably always have a bit of both, and it might just start off at 80-20, then go to 50-50, then go to 20-80, you know what I mean, throughout the development,
Mm-hmm.
versus a more experienced athlete, it might be more of a balanced approach all the way through because they won't need the same, like if a guy squats close to 2 times body weight, um, they probably don't need the same strength stimulus. They might need a little bit, like just at the start of the season, and then little touches, microdoses throughout the season, but they probably don't need a block to go, okay, let's go to 2.5 body weight.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that knowing who you're dealing with. Are they experienced? Are they in terms of like physical development? Are they less experienced? All right. If they're less experienced, probably sequential might work better to my mind. More experienced, you can probably go more conjugate, vertical integration. We do everything at the same time. It's just different mixtures.
Mm. Yes, it's kind of it. Now, I don't want to say hit it and quit it because you said maintenance is somewhat of a factor regardless, but it is kind of, get in, get out, touch on it. Okay, we're at the level we want. Right, let's start working on the areas that are maybe lacking a little bit more. But use the maintenance to because I'm sure you've probably found this to some degree is that if you take it out altogether, let's say it is something of a strength of theirs. Let's say they're quite hip dominant and they have somewhat of a reliance on that they're if you take it out altogether, you might lose some ability to even work on the weakness, if that makes sense.
For sure. It's a always a question I have for myself is should we keep going after the athlete's strengths and keep helping the athlete's strengths? So say they've got really good hip extension. You know what I mean? A lot of their jumping is from hip flexion, extension, moment arms, rather than knee extension, knee flexion, moment arms. Man, how much do you reinforce that, or how much if they're really hip dominant, how much do you go after the knees, or if they're really knee dominant, how much do you go after the hips? And I think it's got to be trial and error with the coach. You've got to be like, all right, let's try this out this season. Um, we're going to get after I'll probably, as a default, always go after their strengths first because that's what's got them there in the first place. Then you might go, okay, let's go after the weaknesses for a bit, and then, but that's a journey you've got to take with the athlete.
Mm. Yeah, there's no way of really knowing ahead of time. Is that where testing, kind of maybe even regular testing, becomes quite important to ensure that you don't get too close to the sun, so to speak?
Yeah, for sure, and regular profiling, like every 6 weeks, maybe you have a flying 30. You know what I mean? Maybe there's a short approach jump that you're measuring, for a horizontal jumper. Um, you know what I mean? Standing long, standing triple. You know what I mean? You want to have those pieces where you pick up the information you need to make sure you're on the right track, and disperse throughout your year.
Hmm. As you mentioned, 6 weeks there, is that kind of a sweet spot for going all out, especially with the more elites? Like, are they not able to maybe test at a maximum intensity that much more frequently? Is that something you found, or do you, kind of use a shorter, more frequent time period with younger athletes, if that makes sense? Or maybe 6 weeks was just a random kind of time point you pointed out.
No, 6 weeks is just based on 2 3 week cycles. It's the only reason, man. You can ask them to max out as much as what you want. It will depend on the athlete. Like you have some guys at the same, it might be two 820 jumpers, Some guys might be able to do it once every week. Some guys might be able to do it once or three times a week in terms of like giving you that really high output. Of course, the outputs will always be affected by the fatigue they're under, the amount of training they've done under. That's why we have tapers, right? So they can get rid of that fatigue for big competitions. Um, and you work that, or you just have to understand that, man, our flying 30 time or our heavy block of training, it's not going to be as good as our speed right at the end of training and after a taper. Well, it shouldn't be. If it is, you might have some issues with what you're doing. So there's that understanding of, okay, this is a progression. And then when you're dealing with somebody for year upon year upon year, you can start looking back, okay, what were we like last year this time? What have we changed? All those things. It's just like a big experiment that you're doing with an individual on how you're going to make them better.
Mm.
And that's
And
why I like Bondarchuk's approach so much, is that it was like, man, there's so many, like I can see him thinking, like, there's so many different things going on here that could be impacting him. I'm just going to keep training exactly the same. We're going to see when he adapts, and that's how I'm going to control my experiment.
mm,
That's how I imagine him thinking about his training. I'm going to
mm,
keep everything the same. We see when he adapts. That's how I'm controlling my experiment. Otherwise, I'll change this, change that, change that. I'll never figure out what's going on.
mm. Well, it's the scientific method, really, isn't it? Is that like, when we carry out a study, we're not we're trying to control for as many different possibilities as we can so that we know that whatever effect or outcome we get, we can attribute it to as much as we possibly can to the things we hope it is or we hypothesize. If we kind of put in so many more variables all of the time, well, then we just can't really say for sure, can we?
For sure.
With with Bondarchuk, I suppose it's an interesting kind of philosophy in the sense that it seems like it's a no BS kind of way to just admittedly open up the kind of idea that coaching is just one big experiment, and like, you can't hide from that part first and foremost. So get really good at like reading the core things and not necessarily complicating it too much. Would you kind of see it the same way, in that like it is really like coaching at its finest when you employ a methodology like that?
Yeah, I don't know if it'll be one facet of coaching at its finest, for sure, in
Sorry,
terms of
yeah,
being able
that.
you know what I mean? And then if and with those type of principles, like I wouldn't do it exactly the same. Like for me, not just for the athletes, but for the coach as well, there needs to be some variety in there, but it's choosing where that variety is applied. I mean, when that stimulus is kept the same, so we know when we're getting the adaptation. Um, and so and there's a whole heap of things that go into the coaching side of things. But yeah, I definitely agree. It's a real simple but elegant method to help improving athletes and take those ideas, those principles, and apply that to your practice and see what falls into place for you as a coach.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, exactly that. Like, and I think you really get to know your athletes well as a result, I think, through that kind of constant experiment, and you're probably reflecting and, creating new outcomes as a result a lot. And I think sometimes it can be, in some cases, um, not enough of a problem solving type of scenario in certain, training environments. And so you kind of end up getting the same outcomes without really knowing, what to do next. And obviously you do run the risk of failure. But I think, again, one thing that Bondarchuk is embracing or sub communicating through his methodology is, yes, you will fail. It's more about what you do with that. Um,
Mhm. Yeah, totally, totally. Just like success leaves clues, failure leaves clues as well. And you try and pick up on those as best you can.
with the kind of work that you're doing now, have you found that, younger athletes have given you a new set of principles that you're now taking into the older athletes? Because you're working with a kind of mixed group. Like, has there many learnings? Because I've been talking about how the elite have kind of informed your perspectives on things, but has working with the younger group really fed anything on your overall training philosophy now?
Yeah, so I should have actually said at the start, I actually don't do much S&C with the younger kids. We'll with the schoolwork I do, definitely the athletics, the track and field. Man, it's amazing how much you can improve someone's performance in like half an hour to 45 minutes with like kids that have a natural affinity for being fast with jumping. Um, you set them up well, and if they haven't been exposed to sort of technical ideas or proper ways of setting them up in that age bracket, that's one thing that's really amazed me is, man, it's like you can put like half a meter on somebody's long jump when they're 14 just by setting them up well and giving them a proper approach into a pit. And there's heaps of things like you like coming out of the blocks well, all that type of stuff. That's been the biggest thing. And also the other thing is kids develop differently. Like people talk about peak height velocity and all that type of stuff. One thing I definitely see is you have some kids that are lagging a bit behind, and then all of a sudden they start to take off other kids that are um, super early in terms of their development, and then they might start to be caught up later on. So that's definitely one thing I see is pretty common. Um, but yeah, it's in terms of like overall development, I think it doesn't matter so much in terms of what age they are. It's more like their competencies. Of course, you've got to be wary of things around, say, growth windows, maturation levels in terms of like skeletal maturation, how much load will go into the kids. And I've had that issue. I've made those mistakes with like pars fractures and things like that from too much work into like kid was 18, but basically when I come back to Australia, I was giving him a what I thought was a watered down version of stuff we'd done in China and on the track, 200-meter sprinter, and just broke him because he'd gone from training maybe twice a week, 3 times a week hard to 5 or 6 days a week. Um, we're still 2 to 3 times a week hard, but we're doing stuff on the other days as well. So there just wasn't as much time for adaptation and things like that. So all those things you got to be wary of. It's like and you got to understand that there'll be different development windows, there'll be different development levels, and also even in a group of if you go from that like age 15 and up all the way to say 25 to 28, 30-year olds, there'll still be different experiences and different skill sets and different competencies in the older athletes as well. And you just have to manage that as best you can and figure out how you want to get what you want to get out of them.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know if this makes sense, but one thing I'm gathering from like, your work with the elites and what you just mentioned there is that they're all kind of because of their life stages or because of their backgrounds or because of, their just biological age, like there's so many like moving parts that make it their own unique puzzle and you're kind of always learning because of it. Um, you kind of just when you
You
think you
know,
maybe figured it out, it's just not really the case.
so one of my favorite sayings is a man never steps into the same river twice. Either the man is different or the river is different. And that's it. That's what coaching is. You're always dealing with something new, different experiences, different life situations, different like maybe they picked up injuries they didn't have prior. So there's always something new that you have to account for and make your best guess, best estimations on.
Mm. It's humbling, really, really humbling. I can imagine certainly, as you as a very esteemed coach and kind of having to relearn that process. And again, just when you think you've maybe really got a grasp of a particular set of people or age groups or what have you, and then like, something else pops up where you're like, damn, like here we are again. But I guess that's the kind of the love-hate relationship with it as well, isn't it? In that like, if you didn't have that kind of reoccurring frustration, sometimes it would be not as enjoyable to do either.
Yeah, definitely. It's not as much fun working on an assembly line as painting a piece of art, is what I'd say.
It's very well put, I have to say. Um, Joseph, you're kind of someone, as I said in the beginning, like that does a lot of different things. Like I've read many of your articles. You obviously, as I said, are a podcast host as well. So I'm keen to, before we close out, allow you to tell the audience where they can find a lot of your work because I think We touched on a lot of different things here, but you've wrote like very deeply about many things, including plyometrics, and I would really implore the audience to go and have a look at those things.
Yeah, man. So, first of all, man, appreciate you having me on this podcast. People are interested. I have an Instagram and Twitter. Instagram's probably been pretty dead over the last 2 years with young kids and things like that. But there's stuff on there that you can go back through. Um, the If you're interested in the research, like my master's or PhD research stuff on, say, track and field and stuff going into 2016 Rio. That's all on ResearchGate. If you just search my name and you search like Joseph Coyne jumps, a couple of articles across different sites, Sportsmith, um, SimpliFaster, all those types of things. So there's a few pieces there that you'll be able to find should be able to find pretty easily if you just throw in Joseph Coyne and that's with a Y and an E, not an I, into Google and put jumping in as well, and it should pop up. But no, those would be the main spots.
Yeah, and they're very worthwhile, guys. So I'd implore you to really head on over there because they cover a wide range of weight training, plyometrics, etc. And as I said, the research really important too. Joseph, it's been a really fun hour and a half chatting to you, and I really appreciate you coming on here.
Brother, thank you. Thank you for having me.